Hello and welcome back to Beaver Hunter's game models. In this final video about my Panther Tank project, I want to show how I applied earth, dirt and mud and how I finished it with last details and effects so it's ready for deployment in a field workshop diorama. So let's jump right into the first step for earth and mud effects, and that would be applying Vallejos earth texture acrylic paste with an old brush. This paste is to create some volume and is applied where thicker mud accumulations would be, like around the swing arms. As this is a summer vehicle, there won't be too much thick mud. The paste, which is drying pretty fast, is then blended with a water moistened brush so there are no big build-ups and the edges run out smoothly. And with some vertical brush strokes I covered the sides with the first pigments from the paste too. The lower hull is a perfect starting point to get a feeling for the products and techniques, as most of this area will be covered later by the running gear and the tracks. And for this reason I totally ignored the swing arms, which will be covered 100%. The back and front were also treated at this point, as I wanted to complete the lower hull in one piece. Again, this paste is just applied in a small amount to build up some volume, where on top I could apply the earth enamel products later. On a winter vehicle I could go a lot heavier than in this case. And as I felt more confident with the paste again, I also applied it on the wheels and rollers in a small matching amount. As the insides of all wheels were completely lacking any details and even worse had injector pin marks, I used the paste to cover them and make the insides a bit more interesting this way. On the rollers I also applied the paste in a small amount here and there and then blended it with the wet brush. I had to be a bit more precise here and remove excess tap water, because this was full of pigments from the paste, which would leaving residues on the surfaces. And here again I covered the undetailed inside of the last pair of rollers. To make the result a bit more interesting and realistic, I grabbed me a case dried seagrass and cut it into small grass-like pieces. This was then applied on top of the dried earth paste and placed into position with my tweezers. And to fix it in place, I then dripped VMS Sand Balast Freeze on top of the grass. And with a brush I could now push the grass around on the wet surface to place it random looking and place it where it could be. I also removed excess of the sand and ballast freeze so it dries faster, and because the stuff is drying out glossy, this is another good reason to not use more than needed. Application directly by brush is also a good method to not overdose it and apply it in a more controlled way. But like this, light stuff like the grass is more likely sticking to the brush and so needs a bit more patience for placing. And again I also applied the grass onto all wheels and rollers to unify the look. And obviously grass remnants would be everywhere, not only the lower hull. Pre-dusting. For two reasons I made a pre-dusting. First reason, to cover the shine resulting in the sand and ballast freeze drying glossy. And second reason, to blend the earth paste and grass into one smooth surface and create a foundation for later enamel products. For the second reason I choose Tamiya's buff, because it matches the dry earth enamel paint by AmmoMig I will use mostly later. As I'm not an airbrush professional, I was glad again that this lower hull won't be visible later. But obviously I tried to be as accurate as possible and only hit the areas where I applied the earth paste. On parts like the wheels, where everything will be more visible, I obviously couldn't allow making any mistakes. This would be different if I first applied a coat of chipping medium so I could make corrections. But to be honest, I went the lazy way here and took the risk, but saved some time. And at least to me the result was good enough to move on. After the pre-dusting was dry, I started to apply the Enamel earth products, and I started with AmmoMig's dry earth, which will be the dominant color here on my summer tank. I applied it diluted with odorless thinner by brush over the pre-dusted areas, not covering the lower hull completely. Then I grabbed me a thinner moistened brush and blended the edges smooth, and with downwards brush strokes created some kind of rain marks and simulate dirt running down the vertical surfaces. To break the monotone look and create a more interesting surface, I applied a medium light paint, summer Kursk earth, into the still wet dry earth. The advantage of applying it wet in wet is that the enamel paints blend themselves and run into each other. Of course, this can be supported and shaped by using a brush, but this is optional and not necessary. Of course, again, all steps were also done on the wheels and rollers in the same order, and the paints used are the same I used on the tracks and in the diorama later, so everything is matching. To break the maybe created-like look of the mud and add more randomness, I applied the two paints by speckling. This time the paints came undiluted out of the bottle to create nice thick mud specks. Like I said, the step brings a lot to the look and make it look more random and naturally applied. With a thinner moistened brush I could blend or remove specks which came out too big or clean areas where I didn't want them to be, like the rubber or steel parts of the wheels, which should be a bit cleaner because of the contact they have with the tracks. When the previous layers were dry, I applied loose ground as the darkest and so freshest mud. This was applied in corners and crevices, around details and swing arms, and again, this will hardly be seen and acts more like a training ground again. Because the previous layers were dry by now, I here couldn't use the self-blending effect and had to grab me a thinner moistened brush to blend the dark paint into the lighter ones. I here smoothed out the edges and tried to make the lighter paints look through in the bigger areas. The back and front areas were made in equal ways, just the corners and a few places near the ground were treated with the darkest paint. On the wheels where no thicker mud would be, the darker paint was just applied in a very small amount and blended into the previous layers. And again, to create some randomness, I used the darkest paint out of the bottle for some speckling, but in a smaller amount than the lighter ones. To highlight details by outlining them, I used the dark brown wash, again diluted, and let it flow around them. This is supposed to simulate the darkest and freshest mud, but in a very small amount. And I used it to simulate some strains made, for example, from leaking oil or other operating liquids. This paint again was blended into the previous layers and the streaks were faded out. And I used the opportunity to renew the pin washing with the dark paint in the back area. And this is the result with which I am very happy, and I can't believe that I will cover it with the running gear now. But it is like it is, and we all know the game. I started the assembly with gluing the wheels and hubs in place so I could slide the track over them. As I test mounted the tracks before, I was sure that there shouldn't be any major problems and everything went well here. And with the last pins I secured the closed track in place. With that done, I could now concentrate on the upper hull. I here started with applying real earth, no trademark, and pushed it in place with a soft brush. Here too I added some dried seagrass to make the dirt more interesting and gave it a used look. And again fixed it in place with VMS Sand Balast Freeze. Here too used the brush to push it in its final position and remove excess fixer. The turret wasn't spared as well, and I tried to place the earth and grass in corners and crevices and places where it somehow would make sense. Although making the model interesting was my top priority here. Again the fixer dried out glossy, but this time I decided against the pre-dusting and used flat varnish. The reason was that I didn't want to ruin the upper surfaces with an inaccurate airbrush work. And on the less dirty upper surfaces it would be good enough to start with the enamels immediately. So I again started with applying the dry earth paint, again diluted and over all the applied earth and grass. But this time I applied the darker loose ground directly into the still wet dry earth, skipping the medium summer Kursk tone. And this time I used a thinner moistened brush to help blend the two more contrasting paints into each other. And as a kind of pin wash and to outline bigger earth clumps and grass, I again used the dark brown wash, which was also blended into the previous layers. Here I started to dust the surfaces of the upper hull with extremely strong diluted dry earth. The idea is to use the high pigmented paint to create a dusty layer on the surface. But because it is so high pigmented, I had to be very careful. When it's wet, it looks like it made no effect at all. But when it's dry, all the pigments get to work and it can be overwhelming pretty easy. And even I was aware of the risk, I overdid it and had to make countermeasures later. But first I optically applied the spare tracks and porters with a dusty look, as rusty bare metal parts tend to attract dust and therefore can't be spared. And I here blended the same dry earth and loose ground into each other. If you became curious maybe about the earlier steps and progress, feel free to check out my channel with the previous videos of my Panther Tank series. The sides were also dusted, although less intensive as they were vertical surfaces, and with swiping brush strokes I blended the paint into the surface. Now I thought it would be a good timing for gluing the gun barrel in place and get that part off my table. I mentioned earlier that the dusting effect came out a bit too strong. This is because of too much pigments from the dry earth enamels which stayed on the model. And that is how it looked after completely drying. Obviously this was not what I was aiming for, and what could I do against it? Matte varnish is the answer. Usually it's more a negative point that a coat of clear varnish covers or tones down the effects pigments can create. In this case it saved the day for me, as I applied 2 rich coats of matte varnish, what toned down the pigments and also gave the model a nice matte finish. And with the Bergswerk matte clear coat I was sure that there is no overdose with a milky finish, so I didn't hesitate to apply it in a good amount. With that problem solved, I could now concentrate on the finishing touches, and with wet effect enamels with a tiny amount of dark brown wash I created traces of fuel around the filler neck. I applied it by brush and did not blend it this time to imply the edges of spilled liquid. And to make the effect more random, I speckled some of this mix onto the motor deck for fuel and grease stains. The shiny blank metal parts were toned down by the dusting and weathering a lot, so I grabbed my metallic paints again and repainted the battle damage areas to make them look newer. With pastel chalk I created my own pigments by scraping the chalk with my hobby knife, and with that I depicted traces of soot on the gun barrel from firing and the exhaust from flooring the pedal. They were applied with a dry brush and no fixer or such things were used, as I don't intend to use any clear varnish at this stage. Then I grabbed me a pencil, or more fancy a graphite pen, and highlighted all edges, especially on the rusted bare metal openings like the hatches. This creates a nice metal effect in contrast to the rust and makes the model feel heavier immediately. And if you look at the model from the right angle and the light gets reflected from that, it looks just great. One missing detail was the antenna, which I created from a piece of 0.3mm copper wire, glued it in place and painted it with neutral grey. Now I could finally add the open track on the side where the maintenance will take place and glue it in place to make it one with the model, so I can move it around without having loose parts. Mounting the side skirts was no fun at all, and worse than mounting the tracks. I was so nervous to break the side skirt holders, but with patience and supporting drops of superglue this was achieved too. To make the model and the scene more interesting, I added the obligatory wooden block and tank jack, which I don't say makes sense here, but does look good, at least to me. And of course the wheel-less swing arm needs to be supported too with a piece of wood. The towing ropes were placed not permanently with glue because I want to arrange them on the diorama later, but just to get a feeling for the look. And with that final touches, the Panther Tank is finally done and ready for deployment. Thank you very much for sharing this journey with me in the last 6 months I needed from opening the box to finishing now. Although it took me more time than expected, the actual work was faster than I thought it would be. Maybe it was just because summertime and my hunting for the best possible result, as it's quality over quantity for me. And because of that, I think about the 6 months as a well spent time. But I would love to hear your thoughts about my result and how you liked my Panther Tank series. It really makes me proud looking at this model now. I learned a world while building it with all the different techniques and materials. The painting and weathering was fun, and after a struggling start with the simmered areas, everything came together, and I am more than happy that I stick to my plan and am rewarded with this model. As this thing screams for a scene and I am totally in the mood for diorama building, this will be what comes next before painting the figures later. But now I will sit here a bit longer and watch at the painter and enjoy the view. Thank you for watching and cheers!